Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 94, Reform Reflections. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And we are here for our look-back episode on the series of interviews that we did exploring the Reform movement. Before we get started, I want to talk a little bit, as we do when we do these reflection episodes, about how you can support Judaism Unbound. Today's episode is coming out on December 1st, so this is the month when people are often thinking about their end-of-year giving, and we just want to put it out there that we could really use some of your support. We're really fortunate to have a number of supporters who have made our work possible. So if you would like to help us in our continuing efforts, we really could use your support. Judaism Unbound is part of the Institute for the Next Jewish Future, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which means that anything you donate to us is tax deductible, and we really will use it well. We're really committed to continuing to make new episodes of Judaism Unbound every single week. We're one of the few Jewish podcasts that's been doing that. And we want to actually even start more podcasts in the year ahead and all sorts of new resources. But we can only do that with your support. So if you've been enjoying Judaism Unbound every week over the last year, we would be so grateful if you would consider a gift. If you're able to give a large gift, that would be wonderful. But if you're able only to give a more modest gift, we would suggest that perhaps $1 for every episode that you've listened to. So if everybody who's out there listening would be able to contribute something like $50 a year to Judaism Unbound, we would actually be in really good shape as a nonprofit organization. Please go to www.judaismunbound.com/donate to find all kinds of ways that you can make a donation. You can make a one-time donation. You can make a recurring monthly donation. Whatever you're able to do, we'd be really grateful for. And we really hope that in this month of December, as the end of the tax year goes on, that you will make a generous gift to Judaism Unbound for next year. Thank you so much. And so now let's jump into our conversation looking at Reform Judaism. Lex, I just want to put out the initial hypothesis that there are cases in the world where large existing players in a certain enterprise are able to innovate and sort of make the switch with whatever is happening in the society around them to do something profoundly different and to be successful doing that. And one of the questions that I had coming into this was whether Reform Judaism might be that entity within Judaism, within the Jewish world, the one most likely to be able to kind of make it on the other side of the momentous changes that we've been exploring over the course of this podcast. And the two reasons that I had in mind in terms of a hypothesis were because, number one, the Reform movement was ideologically compatible with an idea that a lot is changing and we're going to have to change Judaism as a result, that in many ways that's the birth story of the Reform movement. So hopefully it should be a movement that can imagine doing that again. And secondly, that the Reform movement is large enough to be able to potentially keep the people happy that are currently happy in, let's call it, traditional Reform practices, but also incubate new explorations for people that are currently not happy with what the Reform movement was offering. That you need to be a large enough entity to do both of those things well at the same time. And that if you're too small, you're probably going to have to pick one or the other. And if you're an existing entity, most often that means you kind of go with your current customers just because not only is that the easiest thing to do, but it's actually probably in many cases the only survivable thing that you can do. So that's the hypothesis that I came in with, and I guess I'm wondering what you think in terms of what we've learned and how that fits into that lens.
I think the hypothesis is a good one. I think it makes sense, and I think we had an interesting collection of guests to explore that question and other questions with, because you get a different vantage point from somebody who is deeply in the centralized institutions of the Reform movement, like the Union for Reform Judaism, like the Religious Action Center, than you do from somebody who is a Reform rabbi like Rachel Timoner, but serving one local synagogue. And what I think is interesting is that there's sort of two levels to what you're talking about. There's what can the movement, quote unquote, do to on a big scale, nationally or internationally, start to create a context where new reinvented kinds of Judaism can thrive in its auspices. That's number one. But then on a local level, a lot of Reform congregations are pretty big, and we saw this from Rachel Timoner. I mean, the episode with her we called Community of Communities, and the reason for that was that they are incubating within their micro. I mean, it's micro compared to the Reform movement. It's not very micro at all. It's hundreds and hundreds of families, but they're incubating groups in their context that are doing really important work in their community, social justice work, etc. They're incubating groups that don't even identify as Reform, but within a Reform context. So I think it's totally right to think about how this could happen large scale nationally, but I also want to push folks who are in local context who might think of themselves as sort of spectators to that whole question of, oh, what's going to happen with the movement nationally? Maybe I have a voice, but maybe it's a small voice. To think about what can even my congregation with, you know, a few hundred families or whatever it might be do to start incubating experimental kinds of things locally too.
It's interesting that when we asked around and said, what are the Reform synagogues that are doing some of the most path-breaking innovation, the answers that we got tended to come from what was happening in larger Reform synagogues. And that actually accords with the theory, right, that says, look, again, if the point here is that generally path-breaking innovations come from startups because they're able to give 100% of their focus to that innovation and to those people who they're innovating for, whereas a existing organization doesn't have the bandwidth to do that, can't focus only on the currently uninvolved people because they have all these involved people that they have to focus on, that's a hard task to manage for a small entity of any kind. So, there are a lot of advantages to a larger place, and it's really interesting to wonder what is and isn't likely to be possible for a smaller place. What I would put out there is my theory, and we're actually doing some work with some synagogues in New York over the next year to explore this. But in my theory on that would be that a smaller synagogue is going to have to cabin off discrete sets of time to work solely on innovation, right? Because they're not going to have enough personnel or resources or whatever to take it on as a constant piece of work, but that they could potentially take it on as a discrete piece of work that they make very discrete time for. And it'll be really interesting to see if that is a process that small synagogues are able to use to do some really exciting things. I actually think that it will be, but I think it's one that probably doesn't occur to most people because most people are trying to multitask, and actually multitasking generally doesn't work. You have to sort of periodically task. I don't know what the word is.
Yeah. Monotask. I don't know. That's a good question for
serial monotasking.
Yeah. Some listener out there with linguistic expertise, send us that answer. Yeah, I'm noticing something, which is that in this conversation, even from two people that spend a lot of time talking about life beyond synagogues, we are talking about synagogues. And I'm noticing that from a neutral place. I don't think we've committed some terrible sin by starting this conversation about synagogues. But I also think there's reason to question it, because we explored with all of these leaders the question of reform within synagogues, which is how we most often think of it, and reform outside of synagogue, and more broadly, Judaism in a synagogue versus Judaism outside of a synagogue. And we spoke to the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, which centers a lot of its work around synagogues, but what we learned is not all of it. And we spoke to Tribe, which expressly was created by a couple of synagogues because they recognized that certain people in their orbit didn't want what they saw synagogues offering them. And the fact that we keep on coming back to synagogues reflects a form of thinking that maybe isn't quite yet out of date, but may soon be. Because I think that Judaism really is manifesting so in so many more diverse ways than we've thought. And the idea that synagogue is the default may be true now, but I'm not sure it's going to be true for that much longer. And so I think that what Tribe has been able to do in creating, an entirely mobile group in the sense that it doesn't have a building, etc., we could learn a lot from that impulse to say, you know what, synagogues aren't the only thing. And the people that aren't coming, like, even if we do innovate, maybe some of them will come, maybe some of them won't. And we should be thinking about what to create. And in a place like New York, Tribe is the perfect answer to that. You've got tons and tons of Jews, especially younger Jews, floating around that are excited about Judaism, but not having any sort of outlet that they've found that they feel helps them to express it. And that's good. I think the other blind spot is that we spoke to people that are largely based in large cities, and the historic strength of Reform and why we learned this from Danny Friedlander, why it was able to become the largest denomination in America, first in the early 20th century, then it was passed by conservative, then it repassed conservative, is that it reached places that are not large cities. If you're in the rural South and there's one synagogue in your town, it's not always Reform, but it's much more likely to be Reform than it is to be any other denomination. I don't know other regions as well, but I would guess that that's the case in other areas that are not metropolises. And I think we should think about, have we, in an era of institutionalization where things are centralized in New York and DC and Chicago, et cetera, have we lost sight of some of the strengths that can come when those new forms of thinking can come from, places in the country that we don't expect?
You could look at the other side, right, in theory, and say, well, we're living in a time of increased urbanization, right, that the Jews are moving into cities more than they were, moving out of cities in the 70s and 80s or whatever, and fewer Jews are living in small towns than were back then, and so cities are going to be where the most vibrancy is. And you could also make the argument that says and I've made this argument before, right? It's too easy in cities, right? That you could do almost anything and you're going to get enough people to come to feel like that thing is sustainable, so you don't realize that what you're doing is actually not working on a certain level. I actually found it really refreshing and great to hear from Matt Gewirtz the idea that where he said, right, that we're getting 200 or 300 people on a Friday night, and that's terrible because we have 1,100 households in the synagogue, and that's batting 300, and that's not so great.
Less than 300.
Yeah, and I don't hear that a lot. A lot of the reporting that you hear about Jewish activities, stuff that's organized in cities is, wow, look how successful it is. Look how many people came to it. But look, I mean, if nobody came to something, you would say in a city, you would say, wow, that was a real failure, But if a lot of people come in a city, right, it just may be that it was kind of good enough to be better than whatever alternative those people are going to do. But there's so many millions of people in a city like that. If you get 100 people in a city of, 8 million, it's not so clear to me how we judge that as how successful we should judge that as being. Whereas if you get 100 people in a small town, that's an incredible success. And so so if you're just looking at raw numbers, it seems like the city, what's going on in cities is often gonna look a lot more exciting. If you look at percentages, that may not be the case at all. And I would really love to get more data about that from listeners. But you worked for a long time in the South and in small cities. Were there things going on there that you think really fit that mold?
I do think there are. What I think is interesting about I mean, it's a cliche, but like necessity is the mother of invention, right? And in a lot of communities, you just don't have, you might not have a rabbi. So it might sound super innovative if you were to say, ooh, we've got this entirely lay-led community in X city that's doing services for itself twice a month, that's planning holidays for itself. Like, that sounds innovative. It's just a lot of synagogues because they don't have the money for a rabbi. So like a lot of things like that are happening. And if you ask the people running those things, the random moms and dads that run Hebrew schools, not full time, not even half time, that just they do it for no money because somebody needs to lead the religious school in their community. Like that in their context doesn't feel innovative or new. It just feels like, well, that's what we're doing. But turns out there are actually some strengths when you have a space that is entirely lay-led, and it creates communities that buy in a deep way, and families that support one another, and synagogues that do get a much bigger percentage of their communities to show up. They might be smaller communities, so there might be 40 people in the room, but if you're getting 40 out of 90, that's significant compared to 200 out of 1,100. And I knew communities where that was the case. So that's one thing I'd mention. The other thing I'd mention is you brought up the urbanization piece, and I want to be careful. Everybody talks about Jews are going to cities, and suburbs are the thing. I think it's true that people aren't going to suburbs as much, but every small community that I've heard about doing a survey of how many Jews there are nearby. I'll mention Omaha. I know Stephen Abraham. He's a rabbi in Omaha. He listens. So, hey, if you're listening. He and I had a conversation, and he's like, there was recently a survey of how many Jews there were in Omaha, and there were way more than anybody thought. And I've heard this from other communities. Turns out, when small communities actually do the work of survey, there tend to be way more Jews than they thought, because we have this stereotype that Jews are in cities, they're in big cities. But when you actually go and count, they're not all in big cities. And it only seems like that because a lot of them in smaller communities aren't participating in the Jewish life. So you don't have any way of knowing about them until you hire a team of sociologists to really do that work.
And what's really interesting to me is that it doesn't seem natural to go to this sort of next question and to say, could we be a network of organizations that are not only synagogues, right? Could we be a wider network of organizations that some of them are synagogues and some of them are other kinds of organizations, and so on? And so, like, for example, right, it makes me wonder, well, why do we have these independent social justice organizations out there in the Jewish world? Why can't they just be a constitutive part of Reform Judaism? The ideologies would seem to be overlapping. And, you say, well, why can't I run an organization that's solely based on social justice, or solely based on the environment, or solely based on audacious hospitality? And we have local outposts all over the country, and we don't have any prayer. That's not part of what we do, but we're also part of the Reform movement. So that's one concept that's on my mind. And another concept that's on my mind is that when we look at something like either CBE or the association that created Tribe, right, that it was essentially two different synagogues that pooled together to create Tribe, that why don't we see a lot more of that, where what defines a synagogue, where, let's say, in the same way that I'm suggesting that synagogues don't need to be the central organization that this or any movement is built around, unless that's what they absolutely want it to be, because that's what they believe is centrally important, but that by nature, synagogues don't have to be the most important constitutive part. And I would also suggest that prayer services don't need to be the most important constitutive part of synagogues.
I'm thinking to this weird game. I don't even remember it fully, but we played it at like my elementary school and at camp. And you would ask a bunch of questions of somebody and they had to answer really fast. And then it would end with like, name a vegetable. And everybody always said carrot. And it's this strange thing because clearly all of us, when we were learning vegetables growing up, like we learned carrot on the top of the list for some reason. And so like when you think of vegetables, subconsciously carrot is like the most vegetable-y vegetable. And it sounds like what we're saying is that synagogues are the most, like if you ask people, name a Jewish space, like just do it quickly. I know I certainly would say synagogue. And I think people, whether they like synagogues, hate synagogues, neutral about synagogues, whatever, they would, when we would, say synagogue. And it's just going to take a process of deep, I mean, it might even not be a process. We might never be able, as our generation of people, to think in a way whereby synagogues are not the most Jewy of the Jewish spaces, or the most, like, what comes to mind when you think of Judaism. But we can start to build a context where maybe our kids won't. I'm claiming, this has gone implied so far, I'm claiming that would be good. Other people might not think that's good. I think it would be good to open ourselves up, not because I think synagogues are bad, but because I think we are in a time of uncertainty such that we don't know whether synagogues will or won't be the central piece. And I think we could have thriving Jewish futures where they are and where they aren't. So I'd rather be open to the possibility that something else is going to be as central, or a bunch of other something else's, and see what happens.
Well, I love what you said about the game, in the name of vegetable, because even whether, putting aside the question of whether it's good or bad, I think when we look at something like the Pew Study or other demographic studies of Jews, we can essentially understand them as saying to people, do you like being Jewish? And by the way, most of them say yes. Right, that being Jewish is important to me. I'm proud of it. And then you say, okay, well, what are the parts of Judaism that you like? And they'll list off, social justice, the holidays, being with family, even things like remembering the Holocaust, and they give you this long list. Prayer is very low on that list. And then you say, and what's the Jewish institution that you can think of? And, carrot, synagogue, right? That's a problem. And it seems like it's a problem that could have one of two solutions, or maybe one of three, right? One is to say, this is a marketing failure, right? So we need to get people to understand better why synagogues are valuable. And by synagogue, I mean prayer services, the sort of primary focuses of most synagogues. Option number two is that we need to create new kinds of institutions that really accord with the values of most Jews. And the reason why the only thing that they can think of as a synagogue is because actually synagogues have done a good job of establishing themselves as the premier Jewish institution. And so the onus is on all the other kind of institutions that are out there to do a better job of positioning themselves as these really serious, important, authoritative, whatever you want to call it, Jewish institutions. And the third option, though, which I think is a really exciting option, is to redefine what synagogue means. So that rather than saying that synagogue rather than saying that synagogue is defined by prayer services, that's fundamentally what synagogue is, we could change the understanding of what a synagogue is, something more like a JCC. And by the way, this was Mordecai Kaplan's idea too, right? The idea is that a synagogue could have multiple important things going on there. We'll take that one more level and say we could have multiple things going on, only some of which are worship services. And all of them represent the ideal type of way of being a member of the synagogue. And what I would say is that I think that Reform Judaism as a movement and as an idea really accords really well with that concept because of its ideological openness, because of its deep commitments to some of those core ideas. And where I think that the movement itself is very impressive, right? The movement today, the national movement, right? In that it has whole departments devoted to these topics, right? It has a whole department devoted to social justice, a whole department devoted to audacious hospitality. So how could that get translated not only into how can synagogues that are primarily defined through worship services, how could they get better at those things, but how could they become mini versions of the national organization? I guess that's what I'm saying. And that's why I keep going back to this question of what would it look like if there was a rack on every street corner? And then once you thought that way, I think the struggle would be, how do we actually bring it about?
I think that Reform is incredibly impressive in terms of how advanced it is on, to have a national organization whose purpose is, the Religious Action Center's purpose is to lobby for basically tikkun olam, for social change, for repairing the world in political manners. That's, and to say that's Jewish and we don't need it to take place in a synagogue, although they do work with synagogues, of course. We don't need it. That's the Jewish itself. To have such an organization, independent of how good it is, just having an organization like that is great because it says Judaism is beyond just synagogues. Then for that organization to actually have concretely a history of success dating back to the civil rights movement and continuing work today, that's awesome. Clearly on that national scale, whether it's audacious hospitality being an entire department or the rack or these things, we are thinking beyond just services or whatever term we're going to use. I think that this gets to some difficult dynamics, because we all joke about joke about the synagogue that you won't set foot in. You know, there's the classic joke: a Jewish person is stranded on a desert island, and they build two buildings, one the synagogue that they go to, and one the synagogue they won't set foot in. It's true. It's funny. We laugh. It's also tragic in a sense, because if we had a little less of that, I grew up in a community where there were 3 Reform synagogues within, I think, probably 2.5 miles of each other. Everybody had their gripes. I could have told you about dozens of conversations that I, as a 7-year-old, overheard at cocktail parties about all the reasons that they don't go to this one and don't go to that one. And like, it would be wonderful if the reason was, this congregation is the one that's excellent at Torah study and at Jewish learning and at religious school, like the education side, and they specialize in that. And, I'm less interested in that than other things. So I don't go there because of that. That's, to me, a dream answer, especially if what complements it is, I do go to this one, which is excellent at Friday night services. Their high holidays are off the wall level good. Purim, the same. Like, I go to that one and I'm less interested in the learning. Like, if that's what you want to do, cool. And maybe they go to the learning, once a year. We don't have that. We have, that rabbi gave this sermon 3 years ago about a thing that I disagreed with. Or alternatively, I was actively pushed out by X. Like, we have that. The things that have succeeded on a national level in compartmentalizing and thinking about how we can build excellent leading organizations devoted to one or two main purposes, that could happen locally. But it would take a lot of sacrifice. It would take a lot of humility and leaders saying, you know what, we're not going to do everything. We're just going to do a couple things really well, and then we'll build an incredible community around that.
Once you recognize that, how do you get a movement like the Reform movement to not fall into the trap of the innovator's dilemma, which is basically that even though I understand all of the principles that go into meeting these new challenges, I'm not actually able to execute them on the ground because of a set of things that are getting in the way, that are very, very practical, that are my current people who are happy going to services every week. Like, well, they don't want the rabbi to not be at services every week. And so therefore the rabbi doesn't have time to focus on some of this other type of work. That's why I think it's so important and so interesting to look at synagogues like CBE and like the synagogues that pulled together to create Tribe, because somehow they pushed past the innovator's dilemma. And then I would say from the perspective of the national movement, it's saying, right, what can we do and what can we take on that allows those synagogues to do it more easily? And by the way, that's where I would say the national movement really, really is doing that, right? I mean, to have a vice president for audacious hospitality and to be running these seminars, the Juvenation seminar, right, for people from diverse backgrounds to sort of help them gain leadership skills, and all of these various pieces that a local small synagogue could never do on its own. So to be able to make those available on a national basis is a huge piece of what's needed. And the Reform movement's already there, which is, again, another reason why I think there's so much potential there. So what I think that it's worth talking about, like, once you accept that, then you say, okay, well, what is it that maybe some of the changes are that it would be interesting to see if the Reform movement or any movement that said, we're not going to ideologically fight against those differences. We're actually going to embrace them and try to build around those realities. What would those realities be? And that's where, I was struck again and again, and it's not clear that the folks that we talked to agreed with this, but I felt struck again and again by the question of whether we really profoundly live in a post-denominational world, and what does that mean for the Reform movement? So in a sense, I'm suggesting that in a post-denominational world, the current denomination most likely to be able to be the new holder of all of that diversity is the Reform movement. And that feels like an incredible opportunity, and I'm not totally sure how to explore it on the ground.
You brought up a lot there, and I wanna hone in on what you said about recognizing a new reality, but maybe not yet being able to fully adapt your structures to reach that reality. And so we record our podcast in a program called Audacity. We're talking about audacious hospitality. I'm gonna have some chutzpah. I'm gonna have some audacity because I wanna put forth a challenge directly to the reform movement, the movement that shaped me, and the movement to which I owe a lot of my life, and the movement whom I'm so thankful to have experienced all these interviews with. The reform movement has recognized more than any other movement through its audacious hospitality efforts, etc., the interfaith world that we live in, and the ways in which being Jewish and being in a family with folks who are not Jewish is not some huge problem, but is the new normal. The reform movement has been ahead of the game on that in so many measurable ways. But there is a basic structural issue that continues to loom incredibly large, which is that you cannot enroll in the reform movement's rabbinical school if you are in a relationship with somebody who isn't Jewish. More than that, they are the only movement that also bars educators. So you can't enroll in the Hebrew Union College program for Jewish educators if you are in a relationship with those who aren't Jewish, and also cantors. There are some movements that do, some that don't. And I bring this up not to be a jerk, but because I believe deep down to the core of my soul, the soul that was, once again, for 18 years in Reform Sunday school, that y'all understand that that's a problem. Y'all know that that has to change, and that in a movement where first off, in a country where 70% of non-Orthodox Jews who are in a relationship are in one with a non-Jew, the reform movement is going to be comparable to that. Like, that's actually boxing out the majority of people from being leaders of the reform movement. If we're going to be serious about audacious hospitality, it has to be more than hospitality in the sense of welcoming into a space. It has, and April Baskin voiced this. It has to be allowing people not only to have a seat at the table, but to decide what the agenda is, to lead. And I got to be honest, to me, it strikes to my core that it continues to be the case that being in a relationship with a non-Jew, as much as it's understood as a reality and a normal thing and welcomed, is not welcome to the point where those people can actually be the leaders. And so we got to get there. And I use we in the broad Jewish sense because I'm not a leader in the reform movement. Maybe there will be a day where I could be.
To say that somebody can't become a rabbi in a particular movement, right, is to say that somebody in some way fails to live up to the ideal of that movement. You know, look, I would say that I personally believe that in the future, the reform movement will accept rabbinical students and rabbis who are in interfaith relationships. I believe that will happen. So the question now becomes, if we agree that that will happen, what a tragedy from now, when we've agreed that it will happen, until whenever it does happen, that over that course of time, there's going to be people suffering, right? There are going to be people who, and not only people suffering because they are not seen as living up to the ideals, but they're not going to be able to be put in a position where they can alleviate the suffering of the others who are like them and who would respond to their leadership. So now this is, again, not put out there to knock the reform movement in any way. It's to explore a reality of change and changed circumstances for any existing movement. That's, to me, is this question of, like, how do we place these questions really firmly and really powerfully and really urgently on the agenda of not only the reform movement as a national movement, but on every single reform synagogue and every single reform rabbi, on every single reform lay leader, to say, we actually are sitting on a gold mine, right? We have an opportunity to be the movement that brings the American Jewish community into the future by embracing the reality of the American Jewish people as they are. So that to me is the challenge of where we are. And, and I think that like where I'm excited about where we are in our interviews is feeling much more powerfully than I felt when we started off, that the building blocks are there. The tribe synagogues are willing to take the risk that this doesn't feed our membership in the future. And CBE is willing to take the risk that says we're going to become the hub of anti-Trump resistance in Brooklyn, and we're going to not worry that that's going to somehow undermine our capacity to get people to pay their membership dues, whatever the case may be. These are synagogues that are willing to take these kinds of risks and to really experiment in ways to say, how can we really bring our vision, our ideology together with the needs of the people? And so that makes me even more excited that there's a possibility.
I want to revisit, in my mind, the way to do that in a particularly effective way for the people that we're talking about, we've said the word social justice about 800 times this episode. We said it a similar number of times with other guests, but social justice as the crux of what Judaism means was brought up by person after person as the reason why they connect to Reform Judaism. I believe them deeply. I hear it from my own network of people involved in the Reform movement. What we did not hear was that the reason they are Reform is because they find the services to be the most compelling of the various Jewish services that are out there. I'm sure that many of these same people love Reform services. I'm sure they have melodies that speak to their souls. I certainly do. That's not what they said. The core of the Reform movement seems to be something that is different from what some people think it is. The core of the Reform movement is not the Reform take on Jewish prayer or Jewish liturgy or Jewish holidays or Jewish whatever. It's not that they do one day for some holidays when others do two. It's not, that's not the core of Reform. It's just not. That's what Reform has chosen to do based on the core of some other denominations and how they've mapped it onto their own universe. The core of Reform Judaism, which I think is beautiful and wonderful, is a devotion to make the world a better place through the lens of Judaism. I can't speak on behalf of anybody else. If some of our guests would disagree with me, that's their right. It's the sense I get. And what that means is that to be fully true to itself is to own social justice wholeheartedly and fully on a national level, which I think, check, done, that's happening, awesome. And on a local level, to the point where we move from, social justice committee being one committee of 9 on the board that has 4 people that does a canned food drive once a year, to thinking systemically about what the world needs and how it is going to be better. And yes, occasionally finding Jewish anchor texts or whatever to have it feel authentic, but knowing that even if it doesn't, that is a genuine Jewish thing to do. That to me is the biggest piece of what the Reform movement could do to excel. And no, I'm being careful with my language because I don't want to say in order to get people. I think that's I think that is likely, given what everybody's describing, that there is this attraction to working on the world and not just doing it generally, but doing it through a Jewish lens. I do think that it would attract a lot of people, but the reason for doing it is because as Reformed Jews, that is what is called upon, period. And if I were a Reform congregational rabbi or a Reform non-congregational rabbi or a Reform person, would be saying, we have to do that work right now. We have to be out there, like Rachel Timoner has done with her congregation, working on racial justice, working on immigrant rights, working on climate change, working on LGBT rights, go on and on and on. That's the core. And to the extent that there's pressure to make that not the core, to be open to community, to be open to multiple perspectives, I get all of that. That's fine. But at a certain point, there comes a moment where organizations and individuals make decisions to stand up and be something and do something, even when it could alienate some others. I think that time is now.
Well, amen to that. I want to go from a little bit of that philosophical point, which I absolutely embrace, to some practicalities, before we close, because this sort of pre-story of CBE from before Rachel Timoner became the rabbi, because she talked about it, but I think it's really fascinating that, as I understand it, at least, about a decade plus ago, CBE, I don't know exactly how well they were doing as a synagogue, but they certainly weren't the place generating the excitement that they're generating today, or that they've generated over the last decade. And meanwhile, Andy Bachman was this rabbi who created his own organization called Brooklyn Jews. And I remember back then, 10 years ago, Brooklyn Jews was this up-and-coming, exciting startup organization that everybody was talking about. And somehow, CBE had the vision to say, could we bring Brooklyn Jews in-house and not, well, then kill off Brooklyn Jews, but could we bring them in-house and they'll still be able to be Brooklyn Jews? And Rachel Timoner was talking about how Brooklyn Jews still exist today and it's still serving a certain demographic. But also, by Andy Bachman becoming the rabbi of CBE, the spirit of Brooklyn Jews became infused into CBE. And I think that over time that created the CBE that we see today. And for me, the analogous story there in the non-Jewish world is Disney and Pixar, right? That Pixar was created by some folks who basically were kind of, John Lasseter was kind of like, it wasn't working out for him at Disney. Like, he was too out there, and he had these, too crazy ideas, and they couldn't really do what he wanted at Disney. So he ended up leaving Disney and co-creating Pixar. And then Pixar became this incredible phenomenon. And eventually Disney bought Pixar and brought Pixar into Disney. And then two things happened. One is that Disney left Pixar alone, and Pixar still exists today and is still doing great Pixar things. And John Lasseter and Ed Catmull sort of took over. They took over Disney Animation, and Disney Animation started doing all kinds of amazing animated movies that were sort of more in the spirit of Pixar, but still a little bit different. And that, to me, is this like amazing example of how some of the exciting things that are happening on the outside of a large movement. Sometimes this is easier than for the movement or for the synagogue to do it yourself. It's to say, can I identify something out there in this community that's already doing well and that's already meeting this that we aren't meeting right now? And can we somehow bring them in without trying to take them over and without trying to turn them into a feature of our synagogue? Can we bring them in and say, we're going to support you, and we want to invite you to infuse your DNA into us? And I think that is such an important example that we could talk about Disney and Pixar all we want, and people can say, oh, what does that have to do with Judaism? But when we see that happening exactly that way with CBE and Brooklyn Jews, I think it's so inspiring to say, yeah, this is how change can happen. And this is actually a practical way that change can happen. And so when you come back to the Reform movement, again, I say, like, look, one thing is, what can we do nationally? Two is, what can we do to help individual synagogues try out some of these innovations and do more interesting things? But the third is, like, maybe we can support a network of people out there that are doing all these startups and experiments with the expectation that if they are successful, maybe we'll be able to reintegrate them into the movement in a way that really amplifies their power rather than destroying their power. So I think it's like, so again, there's so many possibilities, and just these hints that we've seen on the ground are really inspiring and really, to me, say this is possible.
On that awesome note, we are going to close this episode out and this series of episodes out on the Reform movement. It's been a great one. And we want to encourage all of you out there to be in touch with us as we do close. So there's a few ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can check out our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, you can always hit us up via email at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last plug we like to make, and which Dan brought up at the beginning of the episode, is that you can always support us financially at JudaismUnbound.com/donate with either a monthly recurring donation or a one-time gift. So we really appreciate you checking out all these episodes. We encourage you to revisit the earlier ones in the Reform series if you haven't yet. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.